What if everything you were ever taught about the American West was a lie? We all know the story. The brave pioneer, the covered wagon, the threat of attacks on the wild frontier. It's a tale etched into our national identity, sold to us by Hollywood and history books. But what if that myth was a cover-up? A deliberate distraction from a far more terrifying and tragic truth. For decades, we've overlooked the real story of the Oregon Trail, a story not of Hollywood heroism, but of silent, indiscriminate slaughter. A story where the deadliest enemy wasn't waiting with a bow and arrow, but was already lurking in the water, in the air, and in the very wood of the wagons. This is the story of the 30,000 forgotten souls who never made it to the Promised Land. This is the story of the cultural amnesia that erased them. This is the investigation into the deadliest lie in American history. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. The individuals who traveled the Oregon Trail utilized wagons. These pioneer wagons needed to be lightweight yet sufficiently sturdy to withstand considerable punishment. The majority of settlers employed modified agricultural wagons, though some depended on models constructed specifically for the Oregon Trail. A widespread fallacy is that migrants utilized Conestoga wagons. This is incorrect. Those iconic wagons were deployed for hauling freight along different routes. They were far too massive for traversing the plains. The wagons pioneers actually used were frequently basic farm vehicles equipped with canvas tops. They weighed as much as 1,400 pounds and could carry almost 1.5 tons of cargo. Owing to the tremendous stress, trail wagons were typically constructed chiefly from hardy woods like oak, hickory, and maple. The wagon bed, measuring a mere 4 by 10 feet, was packed tightly with provisions. If a wagon failed on the trail, repairing it was a laborious, if not hopeless, undertaking. The tires, axles, and the joints in the undercarriage endured the most wear. These components were strengthened with iron. The entire structure was covered by a white canvas sheet supported by wooden bows, a feature which caused some to refer to the pioneer wagons as prairie schooners. Prairie schooners provided a very rough ride. They lacked any springs or suspension to absorb the shocks from 2,000 miles of rugged terrain. Consequently, the majority of migrants walked. This was not solely due to the absence of comfort, but also because the wagons were packed full of belongings. Given that the Oregon Trail was immensely long and filled with unforeseen dangers, the pioneers arranged themselves into bigger processions known as wagon trains. This established a moving settlement that offered the advantage of collective security. The pioneers were also highly organized in their structure. Wagon trains functioned according to written compacts that specified regulations for duties and appointed leaders for the group. These formal contracts were utilized until approximately 1850, when they were succeeded by more casual arrangements. All of these wagons left a direct imprint on the natural surroundings. Even now, the grooves left by Oregon Trail wagon trains remain observable. The route itself was actually altered over the years as migrants found more direct paths. These travelers even etched their names into rock formations, with a famous instance being Independence Rock in Casper, Wyoming, which was nicknamed one of the great registers of the desert. Those traveling the Oregon Trail required a significant quantity of supplies to endure the journey lasting months. They needed not just fundamental implements to mend damaged wagons, but also firearms for hunting, sleeping gear, shelters, and utensils for preparing meals. A pioneer typically possessed no more than 3 outfits crafted from wool or linen, which were required to endure the whole trip. Very few examples of clothing from the Oregon Trail remain in existence today, largely because the garments were so deteriorated upon reaching the destination that they were either thrown away or repurposed. Also left behind were possessions later deemed too cumbersome for the trail. As the oxen pulling the wagons became more exhausted, the migrants were compelled to jettison any object considered non-essential. The path was littered with domestic items like furniture, storage chests, bedding, heavy cast-iron stoves, and other private effects. For the pioneers, the most critical necessity was to possess a substantial reserve of provisions. Walking a distance of 2,000 miles inevitably consumes a vast number of calories. An individual hiking without a burden at 4 miles per hour on a flat path expends roughly 106 calories for each mile. Under the most ideal conditions, it is reasonable to estimate that a pioneer on the Oregon Trail covering 15 miles daily was burning a minimum of approximately 1,600 calories per day. This figure is a conservative calculation, given that a migrant would be confronting rough and uneven landscapes. To sustain their energy, the settlers needed a considerable amount of nourishment. The pioneers of the Oregon Trail were not preoccupied with consuming healthy food. Their focus was instead on eating provisions that could be preserved for many months. Estimates suggest a family of 4 needed 400 pounds of bacon, 600 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of sugar, and 200 pounds of lard. They also frequently packed dried peaches and apples along with bags of rice. To drink with their meals, they transported 60 pounds of coffee and 4 pounds of tea. Furthermore, they also commonly took cornmeal, butter, vinegar, salt, and baking soda from their stores. And naturally, there was whiskey or brandy carried for health reasons. During the trek, migrants would add to their diets by hunting game and catching fish. A bigger family usually needed greater quantities of food, which sometimes surpassed the advised capacity for their wagon. Certain families were compelled to take 2 wagons along, and others brought their own cattle, such as cows, to have a supply of dairy. One of the most crucial decisions for an Oregon Trail migrant involved which animals to bring, and arguably the most vital was choosing the correct draft animals to pull their wagon. This decision typically came down to a choice between mules and oxen. Oxen were occasionally favored because they could survive by grazing on the wild grasses along the route. Some pioneers held the belief that these creatures were less likely to run away, and since Native Americans had little desire for them, the risk of them being stolen was low. A similar sentiment applied to mules. Yet, although mules offered the advantage of greater speed, they were more difficult to manage compared to oxen. Oxen were also less expensive to acquire than mules. Migrants frequently delayed purchasing their provisions and work animals until they arrived at a jumping-off point, ensuring they were in the best possible condition. It was also more economical to buy the animals in a place like Independence, rather than from their homes in the east. A great number of these animals did not survive the entire trek. After several weeks of pulling heavily loaded wagons, the animals would become exhausted. Many would either stop moving altogether or simply fall down and die. The pioneers would encounter dead livestock on the path daily. Occasionally, the carcasses could be consumed for food, or the meat might be sold. When animals died, the travelers were often compelled to acquire substitutes for high costs at the remote trading posts and military forts situated along the trail. A major misconception about the Oregon Trail that is now being comprehensively corrected is the idea that Native American tribes posed a constant danger to the migrants. In reality, the interactions between the settlers and Native Americans were considerably more nuanced. The pioneers were moving through the territories of numerous tribes with sophisticated cultures such as the Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, and Arapaho. The migrants were often consumed by a fear of attacks from Native Americans, and it is this anxiety that has persisted in the popular imagination. The indigenous peoples, however, generally saw the travelers as potential allies for commerce. They frequently provided the overlanders with provisions in return for implements, weapons, and minor trade items like looking glasses and metal goods. Pioneers employed Native Americans to manage their cattle, aid in river crossings, and act as guides along the route. Rinker Buck, author of The Oregon Trail, A New American Journey, noted in an interview with National Geographic, they traded with immigrants for ornaments, supplies, and horses. They were immensely helpful initially. In truth, the resourcefulness of the tribes in navigating rivers was a vital component of the Oregon Trail's story. The journey required crossing countless rivers, and tribes like the Shoshones, Pawnees, and Sioux were exceptionally skilled at assisting the pioneers through these difficult passages. Over time, the dynamic between the migrants and Native Americans deteriorated. The settlers could not move past their deep-seated fear and would often fire upon indigenous people who approached in peace. Rinker Buck explained to National Geographic, "For roughly 2 decades, relations were largely amicable, which contradicts the image presented by Hollywood films. However, when the tribes understood that the white men had come to kill the buffalo, their primary source of protein, which we did in staggering numbers, they became antagonistic and initiated conflict." The majority of assaults along the Oregon Trail happened close to the Snake and Humboldt Rivers or toward the southern extremity of the Willamette Valley near the Applegate Trail. Even so, the number of fatalities was not as high as one might assume. In his book, The Plains Across, John Unruh estimates that from 1840 to 1860, 362 migrants lost their lives in attacks by Native Americans, while pioneers killed 426 Native Americans, with most of these deaths taking place in the later part of this period. It is important to remember that indigenous peoples suffered far more greatly from the illnesses introduced by the settlers and from their disruption of the ecosystem. Although the risk of violence from Native Americans was exceptionally low, the Oregon Trail remained an extremely perilous undertaking. The fatality rate among the migrants may have reached as high as 10%. The sources of mortality were numerous. Pioneers carried guns for hunting and recreation, and fatal incidents resulting from their improper use were common. Other significant mishaps included fatal river crossings and being crushed under the wheels of their own wagons or by the livestock they managed. Severe climatic conditions were also a contributing factor, which included being struck by lightning. But the greatest cause of death was illness. Migrants contracted illnesses such as measles, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and dysentery. These diseases were vastly overshadowed, however, by cholera, which was the principal cause of death on the Oregon Trail. Cholera, an illness caused by bacteria in contaminated water, leads to intense stomach cramps, dehydration from diarrhea, vomiting, and fatality. An individual could perish less than 12 hours after the first symptoms appeared. The most severe epidemics of cholera took place from 1849 to 1852. The migrant Cecilia Adams wrote in her 1852 journal, "Past 7 new-made graves, one had 4 bodies in it. Cholera. A man died with the cholera ahead of us." Calculations differ, but sickness by itself may have killed as many as 30,000 pioneers. Young travelers experienced the perils of the Oregon Trail alongside their parents. Some approximations indicate that up to 40,000 of the migrants were youngsters. Children on the journey participated in the same tasks and responsibilities as the adults. In one household containing 9 children, solely the 3- and 5-year-olds were exempt from duties. These tasks could include aiding in food preparation, helping to guide the wagon team, or watching over any free-ranging livestock the family had brought. There was no organized education during the trek except for the instruction parents could provide. Children contributed a sense of energetic playfulness, which brought life to the encampments. In the evenings, they engaged in amusements such as leapfrog and London Bridge, in addition to singing and dancing. One story recounts how a boy named Robert acquired a pair of Spanish spurs. He fastened them on and then proceeded to try to ride one of the unruly mules. A member of the party later said, he appeared so absurd being thrown over the mule's head. We heard no more about Spanish spurs. As this anecdote demonstrates, children were frequently hurt badly, and some perished in mishaps on the Oregon Trail. These incidents involved a wagon wheel crushing a child, resulting in broken bones or immediate death. A diary entry from 1849 notes, "Chaque pour tomber." A woman and 4 children drowned due to the negligence of the men operating the ferry. So the myth is busted, the cover-up exposed. The real enemy on the Oregon Trail was never who we thought. But that leaves us with one unsettling question. What other stories have we gotten wrong? What other chapters of history have been simplified, glamorized, or outright hidden? The past isn't just about facts, it's about who tells the story. And now, that part is up to you. Let me know in the comments. What lie from history do you think needs to be uncovered next?